I've spoken about the advanced fighting fantasy role-playing game before on this channel, from its roots as a basic role-playing game lifted from the fighting fantasy solo adventure books to something a bit more substantive than the books Dungeoneer and Black Sand, to the current iteration of the system published by Arion Games. Link in the description to that particular overview. What I'd like to touch on today is one of the newer releases for the game, which I think has a great deal of practical use across the board, whatever game you're playing, and that reflects many of the principles that I use myself when putting adventures and campaigns together, again, regardless of the system I'm using. I also think this book collates a lot of solid ideas in a far better way than volumes such as TSR's Dungeon Master Design Kit and similar. Even though you might put the fighting fantasy game into the old school bucket, the principles of adventure design remain the same, whether you're in old school or new school mode. I'm also not fond of those particular terms of division, because what counts as old school now doesn't reflect every style of play people engaged in within that old school era, and the way people play in the new school era reflects many old school era play styles. So for me, they are unhelpful terms of division. Anyway, that out of the way, let me introduce you to the Adventure.Creation system, a huge book of helpful systems that will assist any budding or experienced game master, referee or dungeon master assemble their own exciting adventures for their players. The book itself is split into 13 chapters, the first 3 introducing the work and providing an overview of how to use it. Different aspects of world and adventure building are covered chapter by chapter from there. Settlements, dungeons, wilderness, politics, religion and society, rumours, villains, missions and quests, the notion of an adventurer's guild, consequences and rewards, and treasure. 3 appendices round things off with references to tables, shorthand codes and a flowchart for use using the book for solo adventuring. A fair chunk of the guidelines cover solo play and elements specific to the advanced fighting fantasy rules, but the broad advice is applicable to any system. You simply need to understand that the book was released as part of the AFF line, and so its examples and specifics are going to use AFF terminology and statistics by default. Given that AFF is very rules light, this isn't that much of an issue. Of course, if you're using the book with AFF, none of that particular caveat applies. So, let's skip to Chapter 4, Settlements. A lot of settlement-defining guidelines from role-playing game guides over the years will have you define boundaries and roads and fill in features and geography as you go. Because the adventure creation system needs to cover 2 different bases, that of enterprising world-building game master and that of solo player, instead of this more structured approach to town construction, the adventure creation system instead focuses on points of interest. Through the process it puts forward, you will create a sort of mosaic view of the settlement, blocking out areas by feature of interest rather than the shape of its main streets. Location of these tiles can be determined using a dice drop method, basically grabbing a handful of dice and dropping them onto a piece of paper, marking off where each dice falls as an area location, and a D66 random roll to figure out what major feature exists within each tile. There are some suggested parameters for different settlement sizes, for example, a rough expectation on numbers of taverns for cities, towns and villages. A few more dice rolls or table picks to determine a few additional settlement details, origin, population type and so on, and you're ready to go. A solo player can wander from tile to tile, generating random encounters according to the nature of the tile, and each tile is an overview type of the sort of things an adventurer can find and do there, and a set of random encounter tables. A world-building game master can either leave the tile as is for later detailing, or use the encounter tables and their own imaginations to add further detail. To determine the worth of this method, consider the number of times the characters in your games have visited a city, a town, a starport, or whatever. Do they travel street by street, block by block, house by house, or do they head for significant features in a broad brush manner? Unless, of course, they have an address at hand. So much as I love detailed city maps, such as those drawn for Lankmar and Waterdeep, this mosaic practice gives somewhat of a more at-the-table practical use case. On to dungeons then, but not before I add a note that there's over 110 pages on the subject of settlements there. The concept is simple enough, but in order to make it work, you need those encounter tables. The dungeon section follows through with some of the concepts from the settlement section, except here the scope is narrower, insofar as we're talking about rooms instead of tiles. Some methods of arranging rooms on the map, including using the dice drop method, and using no map at all, are discussed, along with determination of a dungeon's general nature. All of the classic features of dungeon exploring can then be found within the section. Monsters, traps, all of that, and even some encounters that aren't necessarily hostile at all. Dungeons cover about 30 pages of material, which is fitting for the more limited scope of traditional dungeon crawling over exploring a city. As with the settlements section, use for both refereed and solo play is covered. One of the themes expanded on here is the idea of a dungeon as a series of connected nodes. You can actually use this concept for settlements and wilderness areas too, but it more directly plots onto a dungeon map. Here you sketch out your dungeon as a series of nodes with connecting lines. No map details are needed, at least not yet, or ever, if you ultimately choose to use the node map as is. This allows you to arrange your rooms, or whatever encounters that you have up your sleeve, into this pattern that makes some kind of sense, from either a narrative or geographical perspective, or both. Once you have your node map, fleshing out the connections and the nodes into corridors and rooms and so on becomes a relatively easy task. Node maps are useful for all manner of gaming, from designing maps and arranging encounters, as they are in the Adventure.Creation system, to charting out narrative flows of campaigns, especially if you want to chart the reactions of antagonistic factions to player character actions in a more flowchart-orientated if-then-else manner. Roughly 40 pages on wildernesses follow. Here we find similar advice to mapping out a wilderness as we saw in settlements and dungeons, including dice drop and random methods. There is a random method based on adjacent terrain, which resembles a simplified version of a system from Rollmaster's random map generation. It's not the same system, it's not a copy, but the principles are similar and fairly familiar. The philosophy here is that certain types of terrain logically follow into related types of terrain, meaning that it's rare to find, say, an abrupt transition from jungle to desert. Examples are provided using this system using a hex map of indeterminate scale, broadly tied to travel times rather than actual physical distances. The inevitable random encounter tables by terrain types follow, as per the rest of the book, in much the same vein as settlements by major feature type. And, as usual, the setup for the whole chapter covers both refereed and solo play. Chapter 7, if you've been counting, covers political, religious and social factors. A sequence of tables here will tell you the general demeanour of an area, be it an individual settlement, a region within a nation or a nation itself, the degree of control the governing body has over it, and what part religion plays. Gods listed here are from the fighting fantasy world of Titan, but these are easily substituted for equivalents. The area of interest for each listed deity appears on the tables, which makes this a painless task. A discourse on social rank and hierarchy follows, which ties more closely in with the social interaction rules of advanced fighting fantasy, and a section on backgrounds and life paths are also perhaps the least translatable sections of the book, but still have some interesting points for players and referees beyond the AFF game. If the game you play has factors that can translate into the outlines within the tables, so much the better. If you want to randomly create a background, regardless of game system, they are also useful, simply by taking the narrative entries and ignore the sprinkling of game effects. Chapter 8 deals with rumours and events, which can drive the narrative of solo play or spice up refereed play, especially if you're in a sandbox mode. Some of the random elements here tie back into encounters, which is nice. It shows that the book is not simply a collection of parts, but a collection of parts that work with each other. On to Chapter 9, Villains. This is laced with fighting fantasy stats, for example, villains and henchmen, but once again, the concept of the material is applicable across the board. Each example villain type is presented with a mission generator table, which ties into Chapter 10. Here, the determination is with respect to what the villain is up to, in a headline manner, which then connects to specific areas of the missions chapter. This can go two ways: determine the villain and then figure out the mission, or determine the mission and then figure out the villain. Either way, the mission chapter, chapter 10, delves into creating adventures and goals to a fair depth, complete with complications, timers, tasks and rewards. By following the process through, you end up with a pretty good framework from which to add detail where necessary. It's quite a chunky chapter to get through though. In contrast, chapters 11, Adventurers Guild, 12, Rewards and 13, Treasures, are all fairly light. The first discusses the concept of an Adventurers Guild and the general point of including one in your game should you choose to, that of being a go-to shop for quests and adventuring resources. If you've played any of the gold box Advanced Dungeons & Dragons computer games from back in the day, Curse of the Azure Bonds and the like, then you'll have an understanding of how these work. Rewards discusses how adventurers should be rewarded for completing missions, experience, treasures and so on, and is general advice mixed with fighting fantasy specifics. It also discusses consequences, which is quite a nice addition. Not many adventures deal with what next scopes beyond the player's success or failure against the ultimate end goal, so it's nice to see a little discourse on the subject here. Finally, Treasures goes into magic items and other tangible elements, in some ways reminiscent of the random treasure generation tables in the old Advanced Dungeons & Dragons books. The concept is broadly similar. Roll on a bunch of tables to determine what coinage and other items can be found, although the scope here is flexible enough to generate various traits for magical items, instead of table entries for +1 swords and the like. Finally, the book wraps up with an appendix that references back to the tables found throughout the book. There are 4 pages of reference entries, which should give you an idea of how table-heavy the work is. An appendix of codes, basically the shorthand used to identify settlement and wilderness mosaic tile types, and finally a flowchart, which shows you how to use the book for solo gaming, guiding you as a player to various parts of the book depending on answers that you provide to a handful of questions. For example, do you already have a world that you wish to use, or do you want to make the adventuring world environment up as you go? To summarise the book, it's basically a collection of tables and guidelines for using them that you can use to play solo games or create adventures for groups of players. It's written for the advanced fighting fantasy game, and all of the rules references point to that. However, as I've said, since AFF is a rules-like game, and many of the concepts used and table entries referenced aren't terribly rule-specific, the book is highly usable for whatever game system you use. Personally, I like it. I enjoy solo play and advanced fighting fantasy as a game, so we'll certainly be using it in that context. Beyond that, I have started a few experiments delving into its use beyond AFF and the solo environment, and, so far, so good. The book is available from Arion Games' drive-through RPG page, listed as AFF Adventure.Creation, in PDF and print on demand. It's a large book, 443 pages, so the printed editions are fairly pricey. However, the PDF version is definitely worth the asking price, around the £20 mark in UK money at the time of recording. Link to the drive-through product page in the description. And that's it for this video. As usual, lots of things in the works with little time to bring them to fruition, but we'll get there gradually. And so until next time, take care.